All right, so let's talk about some of the limitations and just overall boundaries of a FlexConnect deployment. First off, let's talk about the wide area network. Bandwidth and latency requirements are really based on AP and client count and usage or type, but here are some rough estimates for you. You want at least 24 kilobits per second for your wide area network deployment. Next up, you want at least 300 milliseconds of round trip latency. Uh, it maximum of, excuse me, you don't want a minimum of, a maximum of round trip latency of about 300 milliseconds if you're just using data. If you're going to add data and voice to that, you want at least no more than 100 milliseconds of round trip latency. Remember, voice requirements much, much more stringent than what you would see in a typical data implementation. Now, per branch, we want about 50 APs per branch. Um, that's kind of the limit per branch we want to see, and about 1,000 clients. That's all we're going to see. And at that point, 24 kilobits per second isn't going to cut it. We need at least 1.44 megabits per second. Now, we're really talking small numbers here in wide area network. We're talking about the past for wide area network connections. A lot of connections these days are much, much faster than this. So this is supported. But remember, we're not talking about the type of data you may be running. We're talking about basic management control of FlexConnect. Remember, back to that wireless LAN controller and data anchoring over that. So make sure if we have a different type of traffic that's flowing over this, very, very high-end traffic, we are going to require a better connection. And 1.44 megabits per second is starting to become antiquated, even over wide area network links. I know some of you guys are using that. I don't mean to disparage you, but everybody's moving forward from those speeds, right? Next up, switch port configuration. We want to make sure that everything is configured with the correct VLANs. Well, that's pretty obvious. If it's not, we're not going anywhere, right? So here's what I want you to remember. Most often, we're going to use trunk mode. We're going to have ports in trunk mode to move all the VLANs. If this is not the case, this is something that we don't need all VLANs for, make sure your wireless LAN is at least covered, right? You want your wireless LAN to be mapped to a VLAN that is supported across a link. Next up, make sure that the native VLAN routes to the wireless LAN controller management VLAN. Okay, so the native VLAN on one side is matching to the wireless controller management VLAN in your wired side. Next up, none of this is supported through the iOS XE wireless LAN controller or WCMs or the VWLCs, the virtual wireless LAN controller. So don't worry about some of this stuff. Allowed VLANs must include switched or local VLANs. So if I have my local environment and I have my headquarters, local, if I have locally switched VLANs up here that are in here, let's call it VLAN 20. If I have that locally switched VLAN, make sure that that locally switched VLAN is allowed on this switch and is allowed in areas where that VLAN is going to flow. If it is locally switched, it needs to be locally enabled. If it is centrally switched, then we need to be centrally enabled, okay? So make sure that we are at least aware of the VLANs we need to know. So here's a different versions. We have Flex 7500, the 5508, and the 2504. You can see that the number of groups allowed to us scales from 30 to 2,000 depending on the equipment you have. Right in the middle seems to be 100. It seems like a weird middle point for me, but there it is. APs per group, again, scales. We can have up to 25 in the 2504s. That doesn't change when we use WISM or the 5508. The FlexConnect, however, 7500, this is the big boy, allows us to do 100 per group with 2,000 groups. That's 200,000 different APs. It's a lot of APs if we do multiplication, all right? So that's a very large environment. 5508, we have 25, Wisdom 2, 25. So we have some good numbers here as well, 2500, 2500, and then a good number here on this side too. 600, 750, is that right? Yeah, 750 on this side as well. So know your limitations, please. And right up here where I talked about the speeds and round trip latency, spend some time there knowing that information. If you're going to deploy FlexConnect, it's good that you know the boundaries, especially for your speeds. You mess up the speeds, you start losing, getting false positives on standalone controllers and things like that. Not a good scene.